David, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I think we align based on what I saw from just the online presence. We align on some, what I believe to be very crucial and critical concerns in the mental health community and professionals. And I'm always looking because Elliot and I talk a lot about trying to be more holistic in our approach to life in general. And certainly we know that there are big factions of society that have their own agenda. And you have this very interesting experience coming from what appears to be one end of the spectrum to really moving through, seeing things in a way that you, I'm sure, as a young professional, did not see them, and then coming out on the other end. So if you could just introduce yourself to the audience and let them know a little bit about your professional background and kind of how you got to where you are now.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. It has been a journey. So I did a lot of random careers as a young man. Graduated with a degree in English, worked for an archaeology company, did some graphic design, did some web development. So was trying out lots of different careers and basically looking for something that felt like it could be a lifelong career. And started volunteering as a first responder, actually, and that was my introduction into the healthcare system. So started as a first responder, upgraded to EMT, was thinking of upgrading to paramedic. I was actually doing some EMT clinicals, and a nurse at the hospital where I was doing my clinicals said, "Don't be a paramedic, you should get into nursing." And it was great advice, so that's what I did. When I was in nursing school, I was working at a Walgreens pharmacy, so did that for a while. And then in nursing school, I was interested in emergency medicine. That's where I saw myself going. But my senior year, when we were placed in clinical rotations, nobody signed up for the psych rotation. And I was placed there as a senior, and it just really clicked. So that's where I went after nursing school. I went to a hospital inpatient psychiatric unit.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because having majored in psychology myself, and I remember doing our rotation, I guess it was an internship rather, practicum probably is better described in the undergrad level, at the state hospital, psychiatric hospital in Illinois. And I was more like, oh, I definitely would have signed up for that rotation had I been in your shoes. But it sounds like you kind of stumbled into this realm. And once you got there, obviously then you stuck with it, you enjoyed it. What did you see? And I would imagine also in emergency rooms, you would have some folks who were suicidal. That would happen outside of the psych unit per se. That would happen in the general hospital as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What drew me there more than anything was the staff who were there. They had they had good leadership, and they had built a really good unit environment. Not just with the staff, but with the building itself. They built a brand new psych building less than a year after I started there. So we had a great, modern, brand new building that didn't feel all cinder blocky and institutionalized like a lot of psych units do. And it was filled with great staff, just some of the best people you could ever hope to work with. So that was a big part of what drew me into that environment and made me want to be there.
And I think that's a really important point because when I share my concerns with pharma in general, and certainly psychotropic medication as it relates to, goodness, from the DSM all the way down to just the average general practitioner, you walk into the office and they'll be like, "Hey, you've been feeling low? Here, take some SSRIs." Just the casual approach to it. I think when I come out with my very, very firm feelings, and that people feel like I'm vilifying the professionals who take a medical model to mental health and emotional well-being. And so I think it's important what you just said. These people they're not evil. They truly want to help in the best way that they understand how to help. But it sounds like through your experience, you started seeing that a medical model, pharmaceuticals at the ready all the time, first response to any kind of issue or concern, was not helping the patients.
Yeah, absolutely. But it took me a really long time to get there, actually. When I first heard the phrase big pharma used in a derogatory manner while I was working at Walgreens, it felt conspiratorial to me. And, I had just basically gotten into healthcare at that point, but it just did not seem plausible at all to me that these companies with thousands of employees could be engaging in these mass conspiracies. I figured there would be whistleblowers. I figured the FDA would step in and make things right, and it just did not seem plausible to me at all. So I just dismissed it, and people who would kind of rail about big pharma, I didn't take them seriously at all. That was the attitude that I had in nursing school as well. But I started on a journey as I started to see these lawsuits happening. And they were lawsuits about drugs that I had dispensed to people at the pharmacy or given to people as a nurse. And when you started to see some of the revelations that would come out of the lawsuits, it basically planted a seed, and it started to make me more open-minded to just how bad things could be, and more open-minded to how it actually didn't take a giant conspiracy of thousands of people. It just took a few people in the right positions of power to really unleash incredibly devastating catastrophes upon the American public, like Vioxx. Vioxx was pulled off the market just after I started at Walgreens, and at the time it was pulled off, the narrative was, the problem isn't Vioxx, it's just that people stopped taking their baby aspirin, and that's why so many people are having heart attacks. That's what we were told to tell patients and customers who were worried about it at the time. I also saw, the opioid epidemic with OxyContin and other narcotics just really having an incredibly negative impact on so many lives and killing so many people. And then years and years later, you start hearing about these lawsuit revelations where you're able to, read emails between executives, and you learn about things that are discussed in meetings at the top levels of these companies, and you go, oh my God, is it like this at all these companies? Is it like this for all medications? And if you have the courage and integrity to start taking a deep dive, you unfortunately find out yes. And so that's what happened to me with the psychotropic medications that I was really good at convincing people to start taking in my jobs as psych nurse. I fully believed in the start of my career as a nurse that these medications were fixing a chemical imbalance. That's what my textbook said. That's what my clinical instructors would say. That's what my preceptors would say. That's what my mentors would say. That's what our doctors would say. They would put it right in the patient's note. They would tell the patients, this is what's going to fix the chemical imbalance that's causing your mental health symptoms. And I believed it, and I participated in that for years and years and years before I started to really question that, and before I started to recognize the harm that these medications could possibly do to people that we were, in my opinion, missing on a very regular basis.
That is, I think, something that when you do open up the possibility that you did, and as you mentioned, initially, people have a lot of resistance to that. I think some of it, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but some of it's so horrific, you just really don't even want to believe that people could be so callous. Now, I'm talking about people in the top, perhaps. I'm not talking about the practitioners. They are like you. They really believe that that's what the textbook said. That's what their professor said. They really believe this is the best approach. But when you look at the big corporations, and they, I mean, let's be honest, they benefit if we're sick. They don't benefit if we get well. We've moved from healthcare to sick care, I believe, in this country. And I mean, you can take a real deep dive into that and look at the early 20th century with the Rockefeller Foundation buying up all the medical schools and that sort of thing. But again, you start talking about this with an average person, and they can be very, again, looking at you like you're conspiratorial. And for me, as a psychologist, it's always been frustrating because the medical model, it provides this and the marketing's brilliant. Eli Lilly did their job. So it's that serotonin that's troubling you. That's what's getting you in your way. You just don't have the right level. And yet, to me, to tell someone who is grieving or deeply in despair because of whatever life happened to throw their way, and to dehumanize that experience, that emotion, and just write it off as a chemical imbalance, to me, that's cruel to me. And I know no one is thinking of it that way when they're prescribing. But I try to look at the deeper level. What are we telling someone? That being human is a flaw? You should be a robot with no emotions? That's where my mind goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way. People have a right to experience grief. People have a right to experience joy. And what I learned is that these medications put up some sort of wall, some sort of barrier for people, between people and their own humanity. It takes away their ability to experience those ranges of emotion. It also takes away their sexual being. It takes away their libido. It takes away their ability to function, sometimes to even have children. And when I started to learn about all these things, the first time I heard about post-SSRI sexual dysfunction and read some patient stories about that, and it was something that it had been, I'd been doing that job for about 9 years at that point, and I had never heard of, I had heard about sexual side effects, but I had never heard that they could be permanent. And I knew for a fact that nobody was telling patients that. Patients weren't being told that. And the very first patient that I talked to at the bedside about that told me that he started Paxil when he was 17, and he had been dysfunctional ever since, and he was in his mid-30s at that point, so half his life. And it completely impaired his ability to have a normal relationship, a normal romantic relationship, to ever have children. Those were just taken off the table for him by those medications.
I just saw something, and it's exactly to your point. And because these medications, which I know initially were not, no clinical trials on children, but SSRIs, and I don't know how they do this. When I say they, I don't know how a pharmacist or a physician, and maybe do they just chop the pill in half and say, well, you're half the weight of an adult, so here, take it? Because I don't, and maybe some clinical trials have been done at this point with children, but the concern is exactly what you said, that there are children who've been on these antidepressants. I mean, they were giving them, well, they probably still are, to kids who are shy. Just take some Prozac. You won't feel that uncertainty, as if being shy is some horrible thing, that it's not a normal character trait that some people possess, which is fine. We're all different. We all have different traits and characteristics. But these kids who've been on SSRIs for so long, because it's affected their sexual development, even going through puberty, now some of them are claiming to be asexual. And I'm thinking, I doubt you're asexual. I think this is a medication injury. And you talked about informed consent, essentially, that isn't happening. And so talk a little bit about that, again, from your experience as being in psych units and as a psychiatric nurse.
Sure. Well, I feel like it almost feels like a factory assembly line, an inpatient psychiatric setting where it's, does this person meet criteria? Okay. Even on the outpatient basis, it's when you're in the system, well, we have to give you a diagnosis. There has to be a diagnosis on file so we can bill insurance. Once you have a diagnosis, then you get dropped into the prescribing algorithm. If you're already in that algorithm for a while, it's like, okay, what tweaks to your meds are we going to make during this inpatient stay so that we can continue to bill for this hospitalization, because the insurance company is going to require something. So let's add this, or let's, adjust this. And the entire time, though, these people who, like we've talked about, I do believe that the nurses and the providers have good intentions, but there are so many barriers in place to prevent them from knowing the risks and benefits of the medications that they're prescribing and that they're giving. And we see this again from lawsuits and from the lack of transparency we have around clinical trials and that sort of thing. You mentioned Eli Lilly and their brilliant marketing back when Prozac came out, and absolutely their chemical imbalance narrative that created back then, it completely captured us as a society and also as a medical system. So people have this expectation of a pill that's going to fix their woes, instead of having to do harder work of changing their lifestyle and their routines and addressing things like nutrition and exercise and sleep hygiene and having some purpose in life and having some connection to a community. It's way easier to just take a pill. And when so many people involved in that process aren't able to be well informed about what that pill is actually capable of, that's just a recipe for disaster. When there's a profit motive to keep that information under wraps and to control the dialogue around that medication by buying journals, by buying textbooks, by writing the patient education handouts. My hospital's vendor for patient education handouts was a company owned by Merck, the propagators of the Vioxx scandal that killed tens of thousands of Americans. So, it was right there in the handouts. The handout said, depression's caused by a chemical imbalance and you'll probably need to be on medications for the rest of your life. And under side effects, it would say something very general along the lines of, sexual side effects might occur, and if they do, talk to your doctor. And there was nothing in there about protracted withdrawal, which I started to recognize we were seeing all the time on the unit with SSRIs and benzos, but not recognizing it. If somebody was on Prozac for 20 years and they were switched off of it 6 months ago, they could very well still be having symptoms, and people would kind of get labeled as somatic or, attention seeking, when really they had very valid distress and physical complaints from being on that medication and being taken off of it so quickly. And it just wasn't on our radar, and there were all these barriers to keeping it from being on our radar.
And then if someone has that withdrawal symptom, then they can go, oh, I guess I am in distress. I am feeling horrible now. I guess I really do need this medication for the rest of my life. Although I follow the work of Dr. Peter Breggin. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. Way back when I was a young therapist, Prozac was kind of just making its splash. It was the early 90s, so it had been around a bit, but it was really revving up. And that book, Listening to Prozac, came out. And I read it. I remember going home and telling my dad, there's this new depression medicine. It's amazing. My father was just ahead of his time with some of the stuff. He was all into natural remedies for everything. Went to the health food store all the time. We didn't even have like cough syrup in our house. He wasn't a hippie, but he had that hippie kind of approach to medicine.
Yeah.
And he just looked at me. He's like, absolutely not. He goes, listen, you have to understand the whole system, as you spoke to a minute ago, the whole system is in bed together, is how he put it. You've got the pharma rep who comes and wines and dines the doc and then gives them the free samples. The doc, and even psychiatrists, as you mentioned too, which I think is a horrible facet of our approach to helping people, is that we have to give them a diagnosis in order to have the insurance. Even if they don't want to have medicine, they have to have, if they want to use their behavioral health plan, they have to have a diagnosis so the insurance will pay for it. And of course, insurance will pay for maybe 12 sessions a year with a talk therapeutic approach, but they'll pay for all kinds of meds. And so my dad was like, absolutely not. And then shortly after this, listening to Prozac, Dr. Peter Breggin came out with his Talking Back to Prozac, which is one of the seminal books of my philosophy about everything I do as a psychologist. I just really adore. He's just been a pioneer and just such an advocate for these concerns. And the research he looks at, there's no longitudinal effectiveness of any of this. There may be a couple week bump in mood, which is probably the placebo effect anyway. But it's so, and then you're rewiring your brain to the extent that all the things you've talked about with, I mean, libido, with people gain weight. I mean, you're depressed and now you don't want to have sex with your husband and you're gaining weight. Like, did that make things better? It's
Yeah,
just,
exactly.
it's so simplistic and very, very harmful. But I'm curious what you have experienced. When I share some of this stuff, people oftentimes, they kind of glaze over. I probably should dial it down. I probably get too too enthusiastic because I just want to, I feel that people are being lied to, just to be just very blunt. I feel like people are being lied to and they don't know it because they're not in our field. So how would they know? We trust these authorities. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. So if I go to a lawyer, I'm assuming he's going to then advocate for me. If I go to a doctor, I'm assuming they're advocating for me. And these entities cannot be trusted, is what I believe. And so I get adamant, but back to the point, people's eyes glaze over, or they'll say, well, Prozac saved my sister's life, or I was on Xanax for anxiety and it's the best thing ever. How do you respond when people say, no, I love my drugs?
Yeah, good question. I agree. A lot of people's eyes do just kind of glaze over, and I have worked with patients who absolutely swear that these
Right.
medications were life-changing and life-saving for them, and that's obviously a completely valid experience. I would say that for me, the people who sing the praises of psychotropic medications are few and far between. Most of the thousands of patients I've talked with over the years, when I ask them how their meds are going, it's kind of like, well, they're okay, it's all right. There's one of the most disturbing things about the work of Irving Kirsch with The Emperor's New Drugs was that it's disturbing that it took FOIA requests to get the clinical trials to be released to the public. Like, if you're a doctor prescribing these and you're a patient taking these, why are the clinical trials hidden from you? And then in his analysis of them, looking at the just basically marginal difference between these drugs and placebo, if they were harmless, maybe that would be okay. But we also know that they didn't do due diligence in actually looking for harms. I mean, we talked a little bit about withdrawal, and in the clinical trials, they would give these drugs to people for 6 weeks. How can you possibly think that you have a handle on withdrawal after such a short amount of time, when at this point people have been on these medications for decades? So, yeah, I do think that, and coming from a hospital setting, if there is an environment where it's okay to be kind of liberal with these medications, it would be in an inpatient psychiatric setting where people are in acute crisis, where maybe somebody is floridly manic or psychotic and actively hallucinating, or they are literally so depressed that they can't get out of bed. Like, this is a time and place to try these things and to see if these help people, because there are occasions where they really do, and I've seen it. And people who've experienced that's certainly valid. But the narrative that, oh, well, that means you need to be on this for the rest of your life, that's marketing. That's not good patient care. The goal should always be to get people back on their feet and have them living their best lives on as little medication as possible, including no medication.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that really speaks to where I would love to see our healthcare get to. Acute care, absolutely. If I get into a car wreck and I break my leg, I need acute care. And Western medicine comes in with all its tools, and it's wonderful. But looking at a Western medical model, certainly for emotional and mental health, I don't think it has a lot to offer at this point, except for acute care. And I've even a former colleague, when I was a professor, she was a clinical social worker, LCSW, and she was treating schizophrenic individuals without medication. She really believed even some of those those of you not in the field, schizophrenia is not split personality, although sometimes it's characterized that way, but it's when you break from reality. So you're hearing voices oftentimes, or you're believing delusions that, like, that are just obviously not true. So it's a break from reality, and it's considered one of the most difficult mental illnesses to address. So I get excited when I see even some of these conditions that I don't, this is not maybe a fair assessment, but it feels like sometimes people just give up on those. Like, oh, schizophrenia diagnosis, it's going to be lifelong medication forever. And it just sounds like your experience. Yes, you see a role for medication at times in those acute instances, but the goal should always be to have that more holistic. And I just, again, it just speaks to people can have psychotic breaks. Life is hard. People can have that, but we don't have to see them and define them and label them. And again, goes back to diagnosis, which is why I'm just not a fan of the DSM. And when we're always putting a label on someone, well, they identify with that label. They internalize it. Now I'm a schizophrenic. I'll always be a schizophrenic, rather than saying I went through a very, very difficult time. Maybe you lost several family members in a car accident or something, like that you would lose touch with reality for a period of time. Makes perfect sense, honestly. Most of our emotional responses make sense if you look at the context.
Yeah, they do, absolutely. There used to be, have you heard of Soteria houses?
Mm-mm.
They were in the 1970s and I think into the 1980s, they were these facilities that would take first episode psychosis patients and manage them in kind of a group setting where they would have trained techs just kind of keep people safe. And their outcomes were fantastic. The length of stay was comparable to an inpatient hospital stay, but they did it all without medication. And then their long-term outcomes were fantastic. People, years later were way more likely to be employed, way more likely to have a family, way more likely to be contributing to society than patients that had been sent down the medication route, who were, all too often holding down a couch in a group home, just morbidly obese and having no quality of life.
Wow. That approach, again, it's unfortunately, maybe the 70s, again, they were maybe a little bit more holistic and with that hippie culture, which I say that with all love and respect, because as being someone who's pretty crunchy myself, I really admire those values. It just feels like there was a deeper respect, honestly, for humanity. And that's such a powerful way of framing and then treating an individual. I think about people like, people will even say in our vernacular, they'll say something like, he went off his meds. And I'm thinking, like, that's why they were acting goofy or whatever the case may be. And I'm thinking, but that's the goal. That's the goal. And I think about people, you hear tragic stories of people, even some of these school shooters and this rampant violence. Well, Prozac has had a black box warning since 2004 that it is related to homicidal and suicidal ideation. Make that make sense for me. That we're hopping people on medications and then we're surprised when they're actually, the side effects are displaying themselves.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that when you really start to think about it, it really doesn't make sense. It's like, okay, here's your antidepressant. The side effects of your antidepressant, well, it might be constipation, might be diarrhea, might make you tired all the time, but also give you insomnia so you can't sleep at night, might cause sexual dysfunction. Well, you're just basically listing the side effects of depression too. And so I'm going to take a medication that might make me more suicidal and is going to give me all the physical manifestations of my depression. How does this make sense? Especially when it's, marginally more effective than placebo. It doesn't make much sense to me anymore.
Yeah. And I'm sure just knowing that you being very much in that medical model. And then I'm sure there were some moments of you, like you said, you started looking at these lawsuits and looking at why aren't these clinical trials? Why aren't the results available? And started to question. And I'm sure there was part of you, though, having been in it, like anyone, this is my value system. I've been living this. I've been believing, I've been helping people. And then to have to kind of pull yourself out of that, I'm sure that was, whenever we have a paradigm shift, there can oftentimes be some resistance because we're thinking, no, that's how I saw the world, and this is a 180, and that's hard.
Yeah,
How was that for you personally?
It was awful. It was
Yeah.
distressing. It was,
Yeah.
there's a framework of professional nursing called novice to expert. And the premise is when you start in a new environment as a nurse, you learn from your preceptors and your mentors and your doctors, and you get on the job experience. And as time progresses, you become more of an expert in your field until you get to the point where you're the one precepting people and you're the one people turn to when they have questions. And I progressed along that line. I became a charge nurse. I chaired committees. I took on challenges. I kept things interesting for myself and kept learning and really thriving in that system. And got to the point where I won an Excellence in Nursing Award. I was incredibly proud of that. It was kind of a pinnacle, and that was at the exact same time that I was starting to go down these rabbit holes about what actually was in the clinical trials and about some of these scandals and about some of the issues with SSRIs and with metabolic syndrome and with protracted benzodiazepine withdrawal. And I all of a sudden, felt like I was a novice again, except I hadn't changed environments, and I also didn't have a mentor to look to around there for guidance. And yeah, that was awful. It was very distressing to me. I was starting to wonder if I was participating in a system that was doing more harm than good, and I can completely understand people who choose to put up maybe some cognitive dissonance, who choose to not go down those rabbit holes and not believe those awful things that they're participating in. It's part of how they guard themselves and part of how they convince themselves that they're doing good in the world, and it's way easier to just kind of label these anti-psychiatry doctors as fringe and as conspiracy theorists, and like, oh, these doctors and influencers who are steering people away from psych meds, they're harming people. These patients who aren't on their medications, they're being damaged, and it allows them to kind of take this intellectual and moral high ground. I bet that's a lot nicer than things have been for me, because it's not been fun to have your belief system kind of crumble underneath you.
And you had professional connections, and when you parted ways with that, you lost friends, you lost community. You spoke about community earlier. I'm sure you found new community in this more holistic approach, but that couldn't have been easy. And people feeling like you're judging them now, that you've taken a different stance, or that you think you know more than them. I'm sure there was a lot of various dynamics at work with your relationships.
Yeah, there were a lot of dynamics at work, and for a while, I was actually, for as distressed as I was very motivated. Like, well, I'm actually well positioned on my unit to at least change things in my neck of the woods. I have the respect of my coworkers already. I've even as a nurse, I have enough influence here that I can start to change things. So I did. I started to redo our patient education handouts so they weren't written by Merck anymore, and started doing that sort of thing. Just like, well, I can't change the FDA. I can't change leadership at Merck or Pfizer, but I can change things at my hospital, and I started to. And then COVID happened, and that kind of put all that stuff on the back burner. And then the vaccines came out, and then vaccine mandates came out, and through all that, I was seeing so many red flags that were there with other pharma scandals that it made me skeptical and cynical, and made me want to wait. And my hospital took a very hardline stance on vaccination, and I responded strongly to that, especially as a psych nurse. people come to our unit against their will. They're behind double locked doors, and there are times where people are given medications against their will. And I was always one to advocate for somebody's right to refuse, and that you
Right.
do not cross that line lightly. You do not violate informed consent without absolutely being able to justify it. And what I saw was the leadership at my hospital just throw that right out the window for their own staff in the most deplorable ways. They wouldn't allow their own doctors to consider medical exemptions for their patients if somebody had a vaccine reaction and they didn't want to get another dose. It wasn't up to their own doctor to decide whether or not that was right or not. I'm not even sure who made that decision at this point, if it was hospital leadership or human resources or who it was. But they said, initially they said no religious exemptions, no natural immunity exemptions, no exemptions at all whatsoever. Do this or you're terminated. So I was a very outspoken critic of all that, and ended up being terminated.
Not surprised.
No,
Not
no, not
surprised.
surprised.
It's yeah. Go ahead.
A lot of people were kind of pushed out of the healthcare establishment at that point in time. The sort of people that, if you have a loved one in the hospital, those are the people you want there taking care of them. Those are the people you want there to be their advocate when family isn't there. And a lot of them were pushed out of the system and don't work in healthcare anymore.
Yeah.
It's not a good situation we're in. We already had a staffing crisis, and things are not getting better.
How did you make sense of that? I've never worked in a hospital setting or anything along those lines. As I've already shared with you, I was always a little skeptical based on my father's philosophy that he instilled in me. And how did you make sense of that? That this complete, like you said, just informed consent out the window, any prior religious or medical exemption, vaccine, someone has a anaphylactic shock or something. That happens. People are allergic to things that can be in these vaccines. I'm talking about regular vaccines or whatever. And all of that was thrown out the window. How did you come to understand that? As an outsider, I just got real cynical about all of it. And I became, I don't know if I could have been more cynical, but here I am, more cynical. So how did you, being in the system, and of course you'd already begun your own journey of seeing the medical community in general differently, but when these hospitals had this very heavy-handed, and I was wondering, is it because so many hospitals are now hospital groups and doctors don't have private practices to the same extent? I know some surgeons will have privileges at certain hospitals, but it seemed like the medical, I'm probably not even using the right word, but like the hospital administration, they were getting some, I don't know, some word from Lord Fauci, and then that was it. End of story. And like you said, no connection between the patient and the doctor and understanding each individual's biology, much less the fact that no one should be forced to take an experimental anything. I mean, that, of course, none of it made sense to me. But how did you understand it from your perspective, being in the medical community?
Yeah, none of it made sense to me either. You know, our core values as healthcare providers are informed consent, evidence-based practice, and individualized patient care. And I saw all those being thrown out the window in the most egregious ways by my own hospital's leadership. And it was, they would host these town hall sessions, our hospital leadership, where staff would submit questions and then leadership would answer. And there were all these female staff reporting menstrual cycle changes after vaccination. Everyone was talking about it. You know, if they had downtime on their shift, it was a very common topic of conversation. People were saying, you know, this is like a once in a lifetime, like, I don't know what's going on. I'm genuinely scared. It's gotten so bad. And it was happening to all these nurses and other healthcare professionals after vaccination. And they brought that up with hospital leadership, who basically implied that they were conspiracy theorists and that they need to get their news from other sources. And they were in social media groups that were then deleted, and people had accounts banned. And I'm watching this happen around me, like, is this real life right now?
Right.
And we also saw it happen at the local level with our local media, because we had staff at the hospital reach out to the local media to bring them information about what was going on at the hospital with COVID and with vaccines that were not things that were being covered. One of the things that happened at my hospital after so many staff were fired was they brought in unvaccinated travel staff from the other hospital in town that had fired people. They called in National Guard to help with staffing, and some of them were unvaccinated. And we went to the media like, hey, do you want to do a story about the fact that this hospital, who just fired all their unvaccinated staff, brought in a bunch of unvaccinated people to replace them? And that started me down another rabbit hole that made me quite cynical, because what I found out was that my small town paper was actually owned by a giant corporation with all these financial entanglements with none other than Pfizer. And so we brought photos and videos and testimony and other evidence to our so-called local paper. And instead of running any of that, they would run articles along the lines of how to help your child overcome a fear of needles for their upcoming COVID vaccine and that sort of thing. And it was just surreal and dystopian, and seeing those things play out at the local level like that was very disturbing.
I could go in so many different directions with this. I think we had very similar experiences. You were right on the front lines. I was watching this truly in shock, like you said, surreal. I remember it was maybe right after the 2 weeks to slow the spread. And I got on the internet because I couldn't believe that there was no balanced conversation, that this was all so hyperbolic. And even the early statistics showed that I think and I don't even know how this truth was actually able to be disseminated, whereas others bits of truth were hidden. But that if you were over 75, you still had like a 1% chance of dying from COVID. Now, of course, I'll go down the rabbit hole that I'm guessing you went down too. I don't know COVID, dying of COVID, dying with COVID, dying of hospital procedures that were horrific, ventilators, remdesivir, all of that. But before I knew any of that, and my mother's over 75, and I remember going, well, she's not obese. She doesn't have type 2 diabetes. She doesn't have any comorbidities. She's not, if 99 people are going to make it out over 75, she's one of them. And so she never took the jab. I mean, all of this just, I still, to this day, I don't understand where the logic went. People who are very, very bright, but allowing themselves, like you're just saying, where's the logic where you fire unvaccinated nurses and then bring in unvaccinated people and they can have the job? What? Again, make it make sense. Make it make sense.
Yeah, so much of it made absolutely no sense. And I was seeing that. I was also on our hospital's technology committee, software and technology. And so, one of the things I noticed on the psych unit is we would get patients on the psych unit who would test positive for COVID, and they wouldn't have so much the sniffle, but they would be counted as a COVID hospitalization. Mm-hmm. It's like, all right, how often is this happening? How much of our local and then state and then federal hospitalization numbers are people who are hospitalized for something other than COVID? They just happen to swab positive on a test that has that's almost like a coin flip on whether or not you're going to swab positive. And that was built right into the software. They had one diagnosis code for people who were positive for COVID, and that drove hospital reimbursement. So it gave hospital administrators a financial incentive, an incredible financial incentive to not have a problem with the fact that we only have one diagnosis code for people with COVID, and we have no way to distinguish people who are hospitalized with incidental COVID. So it completely threw off our numbers. And I also saw how our software was incapable of accurately tracking who's actually been vaccinated and who isn't. Our healthcare system is so fragmented. None of these various players play well together. If you get a vaccine at Walmart, Walgreens doesn't know that, the hospital doesn't know that, the county doesn't know that. Their systems don't talk. They might talk to your state vaccine registry, but they might not. And so we were seeing all these people hospitalized on our COVID unit. I know this from talking to the people who worked on that unit who, they would get their vaccine at their nursing home or they would get vaccinated at the VA. And they would be counted as an unvaccinated hospitalization because those systems weren't talking. And this isn't anything new. This isn't anything conspiratorial. Like when they set up these systems back in the late 90s, every state set up their own system with their own state laws and their own software and their own hardware. And it's never shared well. And, this is known by our federal agencies too. CDC knows this, HHS knows this, FDA knows this, but for some reason, this knowledge of this issue that goes back decades just magically went out the window for COVID, and all these vaccines got labeled safe and effective. It was so egregious to me. There was actually a point in time where I was getting really, really hopeful, like, oh, finally, like more doctors, more people in positions of authority are going to wake up. Like, this is so obvious and so over the line that, like, finally we're going to get some systemic reform. But alas, here we are. If anything, people have just doubled down even more and keep the blinders on and you look at who we're giving COVID vaccines to in this country and compare it to the rest of the world, and it's pretty wild. We give COVID boosters to 5-year-olds in this country, and in France they don't give it to you if you're healthy and under 80 years old. In a lot of countries it's 65. Like, sorry, we're done vaccinating anybody under 50 years old, under 65 years old, in most of the rest of the Western world, and here we are, giving 5-year-olds boost number 4 at this point, or whatever it is. Can't even keep track. It's like, what are they looking at in their data that we're not seeing in ours?
Because kids were always at horrible risk, weren't they?
Right. Yeah.
Well, did they end up getting it on the CDC childhood vaccination schedule? I don't even remember. I lost track of where they were able to. Yeah. Well, so then now they're not liable. So.
Right. That gives them liability protection. Right. So yeah, if anybody's interested in a lawsuit, there's just liability protections to the left and right from the PrEP Act and from the 1986 vaccine laws, and there's no chance for people who've been injured to seek any sort of legal remedy, and it's so broken and it's so over the top. I still don't understand how more healthcare professionals aren't awake to the game at this point. It doesn't matter what specialty you work in. You should be aware of frauds with medications that you've given to people at this point, where you find out later just how predatory and bad the frauds were, that it should plant a little bit of seed of skepticism in you to just blindly trust pharma companies and blindly trust federal institutions. It's beyond naive at this point. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah. And that's why I wanted to talk with you. One of my passions in life, really, I would love to see a complete overhaul of the I don't know. Okay, that sounds, I get overwhelmed sometimes. It's so overwhelming. I would love to see an overhaul of pharmaceutical corporations' relationships to the medical community. As we said earlier, they're so embedded together. And even bringing it back to the psychological realm, I just read an article, or heard a podcast rather, on Mad in America, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And it's, for anyone who doesn't know about it, it's a podcast that really looks at the effects of psychotropic medications on people, the things we've been speaking about today, and has a lot of personal stories and people who have successfully been able to taper off and re-engage in life, because so often, as you spoke to as well, many of these medications basically flatline you. You just become numb and you don't have the fullness and thriving of life. All that to say, they had these two researchers on who talked about the DSM-5-TR and just raising awareness, something that you and I, we did this digging a long time ago. I had Dr. Alan Francis on my podcast several years ago, and he was the chair of the steering committee for the DSM-4. And when the DSM-5 came out, he was appalled at how medicalized it was. And he wrote this book, Saving Normal. It's amazing. And that will really help someone if they're curious about waking up. Also, The Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker is another great place to start if anyone's interested. And then, of course, we talked about Dr. Peter Bregan's work. But these researchers, and they were very gracious. I was a little bit more cynical. They were just talking about implicit bias. So all these psychiatrists, so these are medical doctors, so they have a much more medicalized view of the world in general. Because they have that view of the world, they are more comfortable probably going to medications as a first response, first step. And these are the folks who are determining. They're sitting in a task force committee meeting and saying, what is called a diagnosis? Now, let's just break it down. How sad do you have to be to have clinical depression? These are the kinds of things that they're trying to figure out. It's much easier on a physical realm. You can take my blood work and see if I have low levels of this, that, and the other, hormones and so forth. With the emotional realm, it's much harder to decide, okay, at what point is Karin sad enough that she is depressed? And we give her that label and that diagnosis. And what these researchers had found, and we'll link to this study, is that 60% of these psychiatrists had clear conflicts of interest, meaning they were being paid money by pharmaceutical companies. My cynical mind goes in a lot of different directions. But these researchers were saying, well, it's just the implicit bias. If you're getting money to see a condition as a medical problem, a psychiatric illness that needs medicine to treat it, if you're being paid to see the world that way, of course you're going to see the world that way. And when you're on the task force, you're going to be raising your hand saying, oh no, I think that XYZ psychotropic is the way to go. Even at the diagnostic level. So this is why I take issue with a lot of this generation, meaning all of us, not just the younger kids, but we are so mental health aware that now I have anxiety, my social anxiety, my depression. To internalize these diagnoses is very, it's very, the beneficiary of me internalizing a diagnosis is Eli Lilly's going to make more money. So it's so pervasive and systemic. How do you see this level of it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost monetized. It's almost like you get some sort of social credit to be young and to have a diagnosed mental illness these days, and it's something that's perplexed me. You know, when I grew up, it was sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And early in my career in mental health, it was all about teaching people about resilience. It was that, yeah, life is not fair. You are going to have bad things happen to you, and you need to have strength, internal strength, and you need to have connections to other people in order to get through them. And you know, we would recognize that dichotomous thinking is bad. Not everything is black and white. There is a lot of gray area. And then all of a sudden, in just the span of a few years, all of a sudden we're encouraging people to outsource their own emotional well-being to the validation of strangers, and almost nurturing dichotomous thinking. You know, everything over here is good, everything over here is bad, and to me, it seemed especially egregious that so many mental health professionals got on board with that right away because we're the ones who are supposed to know better. So that was kind of happening in parallel to my knowledge about the side effects of all these medications too, where I was looking at how we were all of a sudden starting to treat especially youth so differently than we had in the past, and it was yet another area of my job as a nurse where I was going, are we helping here, or are we actually doing harm with what we're doing, with what we're teaching people and giving people?
Yeah, it's there's another great book you probably are familiar with, the Coddling of the American Mind, and it talks exactly what you said. Certainly in the university settings, about 2015, 2014, trigger warnings. All of a sudden, if I remember there was a snippet from the book where there was a law professor and he was going to talk about if you violate the law, and he had a trigger warning at the beginning of that lecture to say, in case anyone had been physically violated in any way, shape, or form, just that we're going to use the word violated. And this this notion that we are so fragile, because of whatever, again, XYZ diagnosis we've decided we feel, and then that internalizing, like we've talked about already today, to me, it's so disempowering. And it's so inaccurate. And it does reinforce, as you spoke to a moment ago, too, the black and white cognitive distortions that we learn about in my cognitive therapy training, that we want to separate from them. We want to rewire our cognitive, our cognitions so that we can think in a more healthy, positive, effective, adaptive manner. We want to challenge those and dispute those cognitive distortions. And here, currently, we're doing the exact opposite. We're continuing to reinforce cognitive distortions that we know through the research make us miserable. And yet, our peers in the mental health community are absolutely reinforcing this. It's very troubling.
Yeah, it is very troubling. It is very troubling. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And baffling. David, as we wrap up today, let's talk about the positive, what you are doing now, and the empowered way to manage life's ups and downs. None of this that we're talking about today is meant to minimize anyone's distress. That's the other thing I get sometimes, is that people, because I don't want to go to pharma, because I'm skeptical of all that, because I want to talk about talk therapy as a better approach, nutrition, exercise, sunlight, grounding, all the things. People sometimes feel that I'm minimizing their experiences. And I know that you are not about that either. So talk about what your approach can do for folks and why you believe it is a way better way to move through emotional vicissitudes of life.
Sure, yeah. So on a whim, because of some social media influencers, my girlfriend decided to try a carnivore diet to address her longstanding autoimmune disease. So she has ankylosing spondylitis, which causes basically arthritic pain, especially in her central spine and in her joints. And she had been on various medications, including Vioxx, over the past 20 years. And she heard some people on social media talking about how the carnivore diet, this crazy all-meat diet, put their symptoms in remission, and she decided to give it a try. And a few months pass, and all of a sudden she's taking less of her pain meds. She's needing less of those. She's off her blood pressure meds. She's losing weight, feeling better, sleeping better, more energy. And we started to become involved in carnivore communities where we would, she started attending coaching groups online, so we would meet people through that, and we would go to different in-person meetups where people would, go out and have barbecue somewhere and share their stories, share their journeys. And it was it always made my ears perk up, because so many of these people had something in common. They all had autoimmune diseases, and that's how they kind of started down the path of carnivore, found carnivore, started changing their diets, removing seed oils, removing processed foods, that sort of thing. And they would talk about all the incredible benefits. You know, their pain's gone, they're losing weight, and almost as just a happy incidental side effect, they would say, oh, and by the way, my anxiety and depression are way better too. And they would basically sing the praises of how much better their mental health was after cleaning up their diet. And it was, I had never heard somebody say that to that degree about their antidepressant or about their antipsychotic, like, oh, lithium is just, or their mood stabilizer, you know, like Zyprexa is just the most wonderful thing. Like, no, you know, these people, oh, and well, the other interesting thing about it too was that there was no placebo effect there. We talked a little bit about the clinical trials for SSRIs and how the placebo effect is a big deal with those, and none of these people were changing what they ate to address their mental health, but they were all noticing this incredible improvement in it. So started me down another rabbit hole. So reading Brain Energy by Chris Palmer,
I read that
connecting
last year,
with different influencers in the carnivore community, and just keep hearing over and over that mental health and metabolic health are completely intertwined. That if there is a valid you know, chemical imbalance theory of depression, it's not that you're deficient in Prozac. It's you need to look at things like what you're eating and your you know, your thyroid and your vitamins, and avoiding seed oils and ultra processed foods, and just eating a proper human diet can take so many people so far. And instead of having, you know, side effects like a black box warning about suicidality and weight gain and emotional numbing and sexual side effects, you have all these incredible side effects like losing weight and having more energy and you know, connecting to people, and it's provided quite the contrast to the system that I was kind of embedded in for so long, and it's given me hope that at least through different grassroots projects, we might actually be able to make some changes and you know, get people on track to eating their way to better mental health rather than going down that road of just popping more pills and having another prescription added or having their prescription changed and that sort of thing.
Well, that's exactly, and Dr. Palmer's work, and he's getting traction. I mean, he's on big podcasts, and I think he just got a grant from Harvard. I'm on his mailing list, so I think he just got some big donor or some big fellowship or something at Harvard, which is where he is. But there's going to be an entire nutrition as it relates to mental health initiative, I believe. So that's very exciting. And it's interesting because now our other foe, David, is big food, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You go down the one road and then you end up that they're in bed together too.
Yeah.
But talk about when a client comes to you. Talk a little bit about the process and what you're able to offer them, because you're working with Primal, right?
Yeah, so I'm recently certified as a primal health coach, and so I've got a website up, and I'm working on my program now. And to be honest, I'm struggling with what to offer people, because I feel like a lot of this stuff should be free. Like there shouldn't be a paywall, and you shouldn't have to go to somebody with letters behind their name to have good mental health or to get help with your depression and anxiety. So I'm still trying to figure out how to monetize things, because I do want to make a living at this, but I also want this to be available to everyone. I don't want there to be any sort of barrier to payment. I mean, working in mental health for as long as I have, it's the people who need it the most often, aren't able to afford it. So that's the dance I'm trying to navigate right now. It doesn't feel right to me to charge people a lot of money for one-to-one coaching. So it's a work in progress, and I'm still trying to figure it out. But that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in having people, not necessarily through the carnivore diet, but through a proper human diet that may or may not be carnivore, but basically less sugar, less carbs, less seed oils. That sort of thing, exercise, sleep hygiene, get their mental health under control with as few medications as possible. Hopefully zero meds if possible.
And with your training, did they talk about, because I always think it's important because I talk about this a lot, but the research shows it's very unwise to just go cold turkey. David talked about that a little bit earlier. If you decide you're on board with this philosophy and this way of living, tapering off your medications is a much more healthier way to do it, as opposed to going cold turkey. And then did they talk about that in your training, or was that something separate that you've addressed?
No, that's something separate that I'm still working on, educating myself about. That wasn't ever part of something that I have learned as a mental health nurse. So I'm just starting to learn about hyperbolic tapering, basically on my own time. But as a nurse, I also don't have prescribing rights, so it's not I can't directly change anybody's medications, and people who are doing hyperbolic tapers, depending on the medication, depending on how long they've been on it, depending on their own personal physiology, it's something that can take months to years, and that's also not necessarily appropriate for a coaching relationship either to last that long. So, but that's also something I'm very interested in. So, some of the things I think about are starting online communities for people who are trying to do this, for people who have PSSD, or for people who are working on tapering off of their psychotropics. I think there's a lot of benefit that can come from crowdsourcing both problem solving and emotional support for people who've been harmed by the mental health system and are trying to get things back on track. So that's kind of the direction I'm leaning towards right now with setting up a business is that a community model, because one thing I know is I definitely do not have answers myself. That these are things that I think crowdsourcing problems is very powerful. It's disturbing to have gotten this far in my career as a healthcare professional, where in nursing school the mantra was evidence-based practice, and I've gotten to a point where I believe next to nothing that I read in a journal anymore. I've gotten so cynical. It used to be so simple because I could just read a study's conclusions and go, well, I know that, and now I have to look at their conflicts of interest, and does their data actually match their conclusions, and was there a ghost author, and who funds the journal that published it? It's made it exponentially more complicated to even know what to trust, to the point where it's paralyzing. And I at this point trust anecdotes more than I trust something I'll read in a journal, which is not how it's supposed to be. And I know that. And as somebody who believes in evidence-based medicine, I know that's sounds funny to say, but it's I feel like that's the situation we're in at this point. So
I completely resonate with that. So when I was getting my doctorate, it was exactly what you said. People would raise their hand maybe the first month before they realize you don't do this, and be like, say we're in a developmental psychology class, we're talking about aging and geriatric population, and someone raises their hand, well, my grandma, you never went to that N of 1. Never, ever. You would look like just so infantile.
Yeah.
As if your grandma's one little experience had anything to do with what we know about 75-year-old populations based on all the research. And now that I know that the pharmaceutical corporations have bought all the medical journals, they're funding all of them. And like you said, you can have data in a study, and the discussion and interpretation can completely not match. Doesn't matter, just because they're assuming people are reading the abstract and the discussion. So you go to this point where when I started my podcast, I would always have a study that I would refer to, no matter what I was talking about. And now I go, I don't trust those studies anymore. And then where are you left? What are we left with?
Yeah, exactly.
It's it's a lot. It's a lot.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's a lot.
It's a lot. Well, David, I want to thank you so much for your time. How can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about, I know it sounds like you're still building your whole practice now as a coach, but you've got your certification and you are potentially going to do some groups and so forth. I always love to know that if someone approaches us and that's not something we're doing, that we have people we can refer them to. So please let people know how they can get a hold of you if they'd like to learn more.
Sure. I've got a website called describe.health.
Love it.
Went with Describe both because of my interest in deprescribing, but also because of my interest in using mindfulness skills to help people with mental illness and help people on their path to recovery.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's another podcast episode. We could talk about the mindfulness literature.
Yeah.
Although we probably don't trust the literature anymore, so we'll talk about our anecdotes.
Right, exactly.
Thank you again so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.